Hello again, everybody, and welcome back to the channel. Thank you so much for joining us again today. Well, we have another pistol video for you, and this one's going to be a bit interesting. So, a little background here. During SHOT Show 2019, High Point Firearms featured a 3D printed model of a yet unnamed new pistol. Looking to find a new model designation, High Point had a contest called the Name the Nine. And after several cycles of voting and narrowing down, they finally came up with, by popular demand, the Yeet cannon. So during SHOT Show 2020, an actual working but not finished version of the YC9 was on display at SHOT Show. This designation was the YC9, or the Yeet Cannon 9. And it featured a number of actionable upgrades over the regular C9 9mm pistol. At that time, High Point said they hoped for it to be a 2020 release. Well, as of this recording, High Point has yet to release the actual YC9. But in what I am assuming is an effort to appease the massive Yeet craving, High Point is offering a limited edition C9 with a laser engraved Yeet Cannon G1 for Gen 1 on the slide. So now that we're clear about the gun that we're actually talking about, we're going to take a fair look at the High Point C9 pistol because I believe it's long overdue. So the question is the High Point just a cheap gun and a bad idea? Or is it a great value that gets the job done? Well, we're going to answer those questions and a whole lot more in just a minute. Alright, once again, welcome back. Just want to take a moment. If you're new to the channel, or if you've been watching our videos and just haven't had a chance to do so, please consider subscribing. If you're on a computer, you can do so just by finding that subscribe button there in the lower right-hand portion of your computer screen. You can hit subscribe there. If you're on a mobile device, just scroll down below the video. You'll see the subscribe button there and the bell icon. If you hit both of those, it'll let you know whenever we make a new video, and it helps us out so much. So, the Yeet Cannon Gen 1. Well, like I said, this particular firearm, the actual YC9 is yet to be released. But this is the limited edition Yeet Cannon Gen 1. Has a threaded barrel. This one does. And we'll discuss that in the features section here in a minute. But we always like to start off by doing a little size comparison. Like I say, this channel, we are dedicated to concealed carry, so we want to try to give you as good of an idea as possible of what it's going to be like to carry the weapon. So what I'm using for size comparison, and keep in mind, these comparisons are just about size and comfort. Nothing about these two firearms is anywhere in the same neighborhood of being the same. Well, this particular firearm right here, the High Point C9 has an 8-round magazine. There's a 10-round available, but this is an 8-round magazine. And this is a HK USP Compact, which has a 13-round magazine. So you got a few extra rounds in the USP. It's also a little bit heavier for other reasons, just materials. But as far as size, these two weapons are very, very close. The distance between the top of the slide and the bottom of the magazine is almost identical on these firearms. The overall length of the slide is extremely close. The distance from the bottom of the trigger guard to the top of the slide is also real similar. And if you look at them side by side, going over the thickness, you'll see that they're very similar as far as how thick the firearms are. And when you look down the sights and then look into the grip, you'll see that they're very similar as far as the total grip distance as well. So it's a good comparison. There's going to be a slight difference in the weight. Like I said, the HK is going to be a little bit heavier. And like I say, we do this because if you're used to carrying, say, a gun like this, which I have many times, I know that the mass, the overall shape, and feel of this firearm when I have it on the body is going to be very similar, and that's good to know. So that gives us a pretty good idea of what the High Point C9 is going to be like if we carry it on the body. All right, well, obviously we're going to jump into the features section here, but before we get too far in that, I just want to take a moment, and we want to thank our friends over at Don's Weaponry for providing us this brand new beautiful example of the High Point Yeet Cannon Gen 1 for our tabletop discussion today. Don's Weaponry is a huge supporter of firearm safety and education, and we can't thank them enough. So, taking a look at this firearm, and just to keep in mind, anytime I look at a firearm, I try to consider everything involved, including the target market, and what type of a firearm we're looking at, whether it's a premium firearm or a budget firearm. Now, if you know anything about High Point firearms and the C9, this is definitely a budget-friendly gun. This is like a $200 MSRP. It varies, but it's probably one of the most, if not the most inexpensive handgun that you can get. Now, that in itself is not the focus here, but I just want you to keep this in mind as we look it over. A lot of people have made complaints about the look and the ergonomics of this firearm. And as I talk about it, there are some things I do agree with in that department. And ultimately, of course, what it's going to come down to is reliability, accuracy, and comfort. So we're going to make sure we touch on those because those are the big three. So in no particular order, first thing we have here, if you look, we have the trigger guard. There's no if you look on the grip here, you can see there's a little bit of very light, some lines cut in the plastic here. So you have just a little bit of texture, if you will, on the front. There's nothing on the trigger guard, and the plastic that this gun, it's obviously it's a high impact polymer, just like a lot of these pistols are. But the polymer, the fit and the finish, it does look and feel very cheap and plasticky. And that may not bother a lot of people, but, it's not the most aesthetically pleasing thing in the world. You've got your threaded barrel here. High Point has put a 1/2 by 28 threaded barrel on here. And, of course, you got your thread protector there. So if you have a suppressor you want to use with this thing, you can. I'll talk about that too, because in the range section I did test this with and without a suppressor, and the results were interesting. Sights. If you take a look, I'm actually not unhappy about the sights. They're a little small, but this orange rear, yellow front sight configuration actually shows up really good. And it actually wasn't too bad to use at the range, which I'll get to in the range section. It does feature rear serrations here on the back of the slide. They're pretty good. I think these would be good with gloves. I didn't test it with gloves whenever I used the firearm, but they are pretty easy to get your hands on. Not a big fan of the trigger. If you've shot a High Point, you probably know the trigger it's kind of stiff and kind of breaks a little unpredictably. Now, the effect on the shooting, that's a different story, which I'll get to. This does feature a actual thumb safety. You can come up and the gun is safe. Of course, you drop it and it's ready to fire. Magazine release. It's easy to get to. The magazine does come out pretty simple. And of course, just as a quick reassurance, you can see that we are empty and we are clear, and of course we have an empty magazine. So looking at the rest of this, if you look at your grip, you'll see there's some contours cut into this grip that are meant to fit your thumb and the other parts of your hand. The grooves I don't think they're a bad thing. My hand doesn't necessarily fit these grooves very well. I think I'd have been happier if this was just more of a plain grip that didn't have these cutouts. But that's just me. That's an individual thing that, preference. Now, the one thing I will say about these grips is when you look at it, when you get the light reflections off this little pattern here, it looks like it has a texture, but it's so light it may as well be non-existent. This is an extremely slick grip. And I would have concerns about that if I were, going to seriously carry this firearm. And of course, a couple of other gee whiz features. Obviously, the Yeet Cannon G1 is on the slide, and they've even gone so far as to, it almost looks like they took a Dremel and they inscribed Yeet G1 on the barrel. So you have all the yeetage that you can possibly stand right there. So just to give you a little gee whiz information, the actual YC9, whenever that firearm is released, like I said, there are some actionable upgrades. Supposedly, we're going to have front and rear slide serrations. Of course, we already talked about the threaded barrel, 1/2 by 28. The front sight's going to be removable on the new one, and you'll be able to use Glock sights on it. It's going to have an elongated sight radius with the option to do Picatinny rail. It's going to have a rail on there, and you can add a red dot if that's what you want to do. It's going to have an accessory rail that will be able to take, modern lights. New trigger shoe, which is still in development. The existing gun, this one, you can hear it rattle. Well, that's because they had a sear drop safety on the inside, and they're going to replace that with a grip safety on the new one. It's also supposed to have a reversible back strap, so you can change the thickness. And of course, the new grip is going to actually have some texturing with the High Point logo in it. And, it should be nice. They're also talking about magazine development, trying to do something like the 365, where it's kind of a magazine that's like a double stack and a half. It narrows to where they can do like a 10+1 setup. All these things are being discussed. Like I say, none of that is on here, but if you are following the Yeet Cannon, those are the kinds of things that you can look to be in the new firearm. But that's the feature set on the Gen 1. Okay, well, let's go ahead and talk about the range. So, prior to my experience with this firearm, I've had a lot of people tell me that, the High Point C9 is it's junk, it's terrible, you wouldn't possibly want to carry this firearm, you don't want to trust your life to a $200 gun. Well, I've heard it all, but once again, the goal here is to have a fair review on the High Point C9. So let me tell you what my experience was at the range. So, I used several different kinds of range ammo with this firearm. S&B, PMC bronze, Blazer brass. All of these range ammos performed really well. I didn't have any problems with the ammo feeding. I didn't have any problems with the gun not functioning correctly. Now, I tested this gun in 2 different configurations. I tested it with and without the suppressor, and I'll talk about those separately. But right now we're just talking about the gun plain. I also ran several types of defensive rounds through it. SIG V Crown. In this particular case, I was using the 115 grain V Crown, which did really well. I also ran some of the Hornady Critical Duty. This was 135 grain, and it did really well. And I also ran some of the Barnes, and this particular round is a Plus P 115 grain, and it did really well. So everything I actually ran through the C9 Yeet Cannon G1 performed pretty well. Now, at first I was concerned about these little small sights, but when I actually got the gun to the range and got to shooting, I actually found myself holding the sight picture together a lot better than I thought I would. Well, the resulting performance on paper, I was surprised myself with everything I'd heard, but the groups I got from the High Point were very good. I typically shoot at 21 feet, which is a good defensive range. And at that range, I was shooting 1-inch groups or better right out of the box, which I thought was pretty impressive. Now, I will say this. In my opinion, the trigger really needs some work. It works. It fires, it goes bang, but the trigger to me is not very consistent. It's very heavy, and it seems to break really unpredictably, and I just didn't like the feel of it. Now, having said that, like any other firearm, when you pick it up and it's got a different trigger than what you're used to, after I shot a few rounds and got to a couple of different magazines, it started to feel a little bit better. But having said that, as much as I didn't like the trigger, the gun did perform well, and it made pretty good groups. So that'd be my one suggestion. And obviously High Point is working on different things for the YC9 that will be better, and hopefully the trigger might have some improvement as well. So now let's talk about it with the suppressor. This is where things get a little bit different, and I'm not really sure why. But with a suppressor, the gun was having a hard time going back into battery. I'd fire a few shots, and then I would have to hit the slide to get it to go back into battery. And it didn't matter what type of ammo I had in the gun. This happened a few times with both the range ammo and with hollow points. So maybe I just had, too big of a suppressor. I've got several that fit this thread for 9mm, and I was using one of the bigger ones just because I wanted to, see how it did. And so had a couple of problems, like I say, going back into battery, but when I took that back off and shot the gun like normal, it did just fine. So conclusion as far as range, well, without a suppressor, I can't say anything about the reliability of the gun because it went bang every single time with every kind of ammo that I ran. And accuracy. Once again, that little sight picture, I didn't think I was going to like it, but from the get-go, I was shooting extremely accurate little groups right out of the box, which was nice. And then, it was very consistent. Like I say, the trigger did not feel the greatest in the world. I wasn't really happy with it, but I got consistent results out of the firearm. So as far as meeting the criteria for whether a gun is safe to carry, is it accurate and is it reliable? Well, the range proved that the High Point Yeet Cannon G1 is just that. So what's it like to carry the High Point C9 Yeet Cannon Gen 1 Edition? Well, as I said in the beginning, the shape and overall size of this firearm is pretty close to that HK Compact, and I have several different leather holsters that are in the same size category. I didn't have one specifically for the C9, but I did have a Galco leather that was actually made for the HK, and this firearm fit right into it, no problem. And this is an outside the waistband holster. And just to clarify, when I talk about carrying firearms like this, generally I'm going to be leaning more toward outside the waistband for a larger gun. Now, I will do some larger guns inside if I have a crossbreed. Crossbreed makes a holster called the Super Tuck, and you get a nice big leather protective area on top of the holster that keeps it off your body, and the Kydex gives you a little retention, and they fit really well. So I'll do some larger firearms that way, but in this case I used a Galco leather outside the waistband holster, and it didn't feel all that much different than a Glock 19 or an HK as far as carrying it. And the same like with those guns. If you sit down, if you have this holstered and you're in the car and you sit down, you may feel like you have to finagle it a little bit, so it's not back against the seat or interfering with the seat belt. So it's a little awkward, like any gun that's larger like that. If you're standing up and you have, the proper clothing for concealment, it's pretty comfortable when you were standing. If you're doing a lot of getting up, sitting down, then it's going to be a little awkward. But the gun felt pretty good, and I carried it for days, actually most of a week. And like many other guns I've carried, I used to routinely carry a Glock 23. I mean, it was my everyday carry for as long as I can remember. And this didn't feel any different than carrying a Glock, other than a few ergonomic differences. And so as far as size and weight, if you have a good holster, there's no reason in the world that you can't carry this. I have a couple of better holsters on the way, and I'm going to do some testing with that, and then there'll be a separate video on that holster coming up, and so we can kind of revisit that at that time. But if you have the right holster, It carries comfortably, no problem. So overall impressions of the Hi-Point C9 limited edition Yeet Cannon G1. This would actually be the G1 TB for threaded barrel. But, well, you have to consider everything. And, look, I'll be honest with you. The gun, the look of the gun, I'm not a fan. And there's a lot of people that way. There seems to be two schools of thought on the Hi-Point. People either love them or they don't. I'm not the greatest fan, but I'm going to give credit where credit is due with this firearm for two things that are pretty important. Number one, for a gun that's MSRP'd at $200, this gun shot every piece of ammo that I put through it with no problem. The only problem I had was with the suppressor, and I think that may be my fault because the suppressor, like I said, was one of my larger ones. And I think maybe it would have performed differently if I had a lighter suppressor on the gun. So, for a $200 MSRP, I have a gun that shoots extremely accurate groups right out of the box. It reliably shot every range and defensive ammo I gave it. And, while not being my favorite ergonomically, it wasn't a bad shooting firearm. It wasn't an unpleasant experience at the range. Comfort. Like I said, didn't feel any different carrying this firearm than if you were carrying a Glock 19 or an HK or even a Ruger or anything that is about the same size. So if you have the right holster, it can be comfortably carried. It demonstrated it is a reliable and accurate firearm. And if your situation calls for a lower budget, there's nothing in the world wrong with buying a $200 gun. Obviously, if you buy something like the HK, $1,200 around there, maybe even more now during the gun prices being higher. But, we're talking about a huge difference in price. And yes, there's a huge difference in those firearms as far as what they can do. Features and those kinds of things, aesthetics and, workmanship. But if your budget is only calling for a few $100s, you can buy this firearm and you can know that it's going to work. Not to mention the fact that Hi-Point Firearms has a lifetime warranty on their guns, which not everybody does. So overall, if you don't have a lot of money to spend and you want something that's going to go bang, the Hi-Point C9 will do just that. All right. Well, that's going to wrap it up for today. Thanks again so much for watching. We'll be back very soon with another video for you. So until then, as always, stay safe and have a great day.